morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on the Effective Market Research Department, Tools, Practices, and Evidence for Success. So in today's presentation, we will be sharing 3 key areas in which market research departments can grow. And these insights are based on survey results, in-depth interviews, and our experience working with some of the leading Fortune 500 businesses. My name is Ashley Wolf, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing here at Fuel Cycle, and I'm very excited to have you all with us today. So before we get kicked off, I do have a few housekeeping items. So if you have any questions at any time throughout today's presentation, please feel free to submit them to either the question or chat box inside the GoToWebinar interface, and then I will catalog them throughout and come back to them at the end of today's presentation. So today's webinar should actually take about 20 minutes to go through, and then we will have a Q&A session. So with that, I would like to introduce our lovely presenters. So first we have Rick Kelly. He's Fuel Cycle's Vice President of Products and Research. He has spent most of his career in the market research industry, working closely with clients and operations teams to ensure clients' needs are met. Thank you for joining us today, Rick.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And next to me is Megan, our Senior Research Manager at Fuel Cycle, who works with some of the biggest brands in retail, fashion, wireless communications, and healthcare. Megan specializes in consumer psychology and has almost a decade of experience conducting research in the public and private sectors. Thank you for joining us today, Megan.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
Wonderful. Now with that, I would like to jump into today's presentation, and I will officially turn this over to Rick.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashley. And hello to everyone on the phone. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to the research that we've done. We think it's really important for market research departments and market research practitioners in any space to understand and to share this knowledge. And just to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about today, we'll be talking about the motivation for this research, talk about existing research, the methodology that we applied to conduct this research on effective research departments, and of course the results. And something that's really important here is for you guys to understand and know that this isn't a sales pitch in any way, shape, or form. Although I will always hope that you'll check out our product and services. But instead, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Fuel Cycle and kind of set the stage and give you some context for why we're studying this. So Fuel Cycle is an online market research platform serving enterprise clients. So we're serving that anywhere from like Fortune 50 to Fortune 5,000, somewhere in there, relatively large customers that have diverse research needs. And an effort to better serve and understand our customers and their needs, one of the questions we thought was really important to ask ourselves was, what makes a market research department effective? Now, I know market research departments go by a lot of different names these days, so anything from customer insights to market research, market analytics, like all those types of things kind of are fall into under this category. And so that's kind of the motivation for us, is we really want to be able to better serve our customers, b help enterprise research departments be more effective, and c, we would just want to share this knowledge broadly and kind of advance the industry conversation around what makes market research effectiveness, so we can kind of all learn and grow together. So with that, I'll move into the existing literature and research on effective market research departments. And let me put it succinctly, there is not a ton of research out there on what makes a market research department effective. Of course, there's a lot of academic literature on what makes teams effective or what makes businesses effective, but the focus on market research departments in particular hasn't really been done. There were a number of studies in the late 80s and early 90s, but obviously, it's almost 30 years ago, and so a lot of that research kind of appears outdated in its findings and needs to be updated broadly. And so our goal here is really to start diving into what other people have done and then kind of advance the progress here in the study. So because there's no academic literature today, we have to turn to the commercial sector. And the Boston Consulting Group, in conjunction with CAMBR Research, has done a couple of different studies in 2009 and then again in 2015 on the stages of customer intelligence maturity. And so what you're seeing here is a couple charts from their study. We'll include it if you receive the deck. There'll be a link to the study that the Boston Consulting Group has up on their website. Well, what you can really see is that on the right-hand side, under Exhibit 2, BCG cuts companies into 4 categories of customer insights and kind of their maturity and development. So it starts with a traditional market research provider, so tactical, very, not necessarily a strategic partner, and then all the way up to stage 4, which is a source of competitive advantage, where it's a partner with a C-suite, broad enterprise perspective, lots of budget, and really developing that foresight and helping companies see around corners and have a major seat at the table to influence business questions and decisions. And you can see there that in 2009, about 10% of the companies studied here fit into that stage 3 or stage 4. And then 2015, it's only it's risen 10% to 20% of companies. So BCG in general would classify about 80% of enterprises as kind of an immature market research organization or customer insight organization. And so they have like a number of recommendations for how to move there. But again, the literature is still relatively light, and there's more work to be done. So that brings me to some other research that we've done here at Fuel Cycle on the next slide, Ashley, if you don't mind. So every year, in the GRIT report, which is the Green Book Research Industry Trends Report, there's a ranking of the most innovative companies and the most innovative suppliers. And one of the things that we asked ourselves last year when we saw the rankings of the most innovative companies was, does innovation matter? So you've been ranked as an innovator, and of course there's a number of qualifications to this data because it was a non-random sample. It was companies rating themselves or other people rating this company. So just all the caveats apply here, but still it's a starting place. And so when we asked, does innovation matter? We took the top 20 most innovative companies and compared their ratings with the industry average 2-year CAGR, which is compound annual growth rate. And so we compared the most innovative companies with their industry CAGR from 2014 to 2016. And we found that in most cases, companies that were innovative research practitioners outperformed the growth rates of the industries that they're in. So you'll see, for instance, in CPG, innovative companies or innovative research companies grew at 1.4%, whereas their industry CAGR was 0%. And so in most cases here, the innovative companies did outperform the industries that they're in. Okay, and so that brings me to the research that Fuel Cycle has done, and I'm going to turn this over to Megan. So really, and the key thing I'll leave you with is that we're still looking for a strong explanatory framework. And as much as we would love to provide that today, we're still going to be searching for this. We're going to walk you through our process, and Megan's going to kind of show you our efforts to better understand this this important question, and we'll go from there. So over to you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So before I dive into our research design, let me just preface this by kind of reiterating a bit about what Rick said, being that our overall objective here is to figure out what makes market research teams effective, so that way we can help optimize team performance and elevate research on the whole. So what we're presenting today is very exploratory, and it's the first step in a much larger research program that's meant to isolate the factors that contribute to success. So although these results are directional and can't really be generalized at this point, it does give us a good sense of where we should take the program from here and informs our future research. So with that in mind, what we're sharing today is data that's taken from a few different projects that we've been working on since last spring. All of our projects were conducted with directors, VP, and C-level market research leaders from enterprises with at least $1 billion in annual revenue, and all recruited from our fuel cycle database. So we first conducted 2 online surveys, one last May with about 175 respondents, and another last August with 181 respondents. We followed up more recently, last November, with another online survey in IDIs with 29 market research leaders. So the small sample in our most recent effort really allowed us to explore more factors in greater detail and was meant to provide us with rich qualitative insights. So I think one of the first conversations that Rick and I had about this project was, how are we going to even measure or define effectiveness? Like Rick said, effectiveness is this pretty under-researched area, and it remains a somewhat nebulous topic, which makes defining it almost a research question in itself. And by that, what I mean is, as a researcher in the trenches every day myself, my definition of what makes my team effective might be quite different than somebody in the C-suite or even an external stakeholder. So we decided it was important for our measures to be robust and capture effectiveness from a few different angles using 3 different measures. So we included 2 subjective measures where we asked respondents to self-report on their team effectiveness, but we also compiled 2-year compound annual growth rates for our participating publicly traded companies from publicly available financial data, and this was used as an objective financial report measure so that we could explore these relationships between qualities of research teams with both hard and softer measures of effectiveness and see where the strongest relationships lie. So when designing our research, we wanted our set of independent variables to be sort of as broad and inclusive as possible. That way we could clear the field, so to speak, and start to tease apart factors that may or may not contribute to effectiveness. So we identified these 8 broad categories that you see here: training, research partners, budget, corporate culture, tools, innovation, methodologies, and internal relationships. And we developed measures for each based on both existing research as well as in-depth discussions with researchers about what they thought contributes to their team effectiveness. So our categories cover everything from these nitty-gritty environmental factors related to corporate culture, like how engaged are team members, what are junior, senior level team dynamics like, to broader organizational factors like what kind of training is available to the research team and how much of it, how is training being implemented, and then of course to things like the actual research tools at their disposal. So what are the types of research tools that are being used? What is the volume of projects going out? How quickly are new research tools being adopted? And of course, we also wanted to look at things like how well funded and supported is the research team. And so when we started to look at these 8 main factors that we were considering, we were somewhat surprised to find out what is and isn't important to an effective team. And I'll let Rick talk a little bit more about our findings in greater detail.
Yeah, thanks, Megan, for describing the research. So we're going to talk about the 3 primary predictors of effectiveness. So these are going to be the quality of training, the depth of research tools and technology adoption, and the adoption of new methodologies. So I have a couple slides for each one of these. It's important to note, as Megan said, that this is a starting point in our research, so it's a jumping off point, and there's much more to come. But when it comes to, interestingly enough, when it comes to all 3 of our dependent variable measures, the self-appraisal based on the Boston Consulting Group's maturity model, the self-appraisal of effectiveness, and then compound annual growth rate. Interestingly enough, none of those things are correlated significantly or highly at all. And so it appears that some people have a different view on their own effectiveness relative to their company's overall performance. But when it comes to self-appraisal based on the Boston Consulting Group's maturity model, the strongest predictor of, or the strongest correlation there was with training quality. And so our R-square here was 0.31. So relatively high and relatively important. And it's interesting to note that about a third of companies in general reported that they had formal internal training programs. Of course, in many cases, the dominant form of training, which is largely informal, is through webinars or conferences, like webinar like we're doing now. But, so that's by far the most dispersed form of training, but very little formal training in terms of practices or tools or things like that. And in general, respondents reported about 3% of their departmental budget were allocated to training. And the most common amount of budget allocated to training was 0%, and the max in general was about 10%. We didn't see like any strong relationship by industry or anything there yet, which is interesting to note. So overall, companies that invest more in training tend to see themselves as more advanced along the Boston Consulting Group's maturity scale for customer insights functions. And so really the question comes is why the lack of investment in training? And so we did some additional questions and interviews with a broad base of companies. You can see over here on the left, we have a director of customer analytics in the CPG space who really says too many projects, not enough time, and there's not enough support from the organization. And of course, over on the right-hand side, we have a quote from a company in the media space where they say, hey, it's strained resources and overwhelming projects. And so we really dive into the data and look at like what drives training or the lack of training. By far, the overall rationale for the lack of training, especially amongst directors and VPs, is the fact that companies feel overwhelmed with too many projects and not enough time. But at least the data would lend itself to say that companies should invest more time in training in order to advance their progress along the BCG maturity scale. Okay, let's move on to the second point here. So the most highly correlated independent variable with self-appraisal of effectiveness. Again, so this is just how effective are you on a 5-point scale. Was the depth of tool and technology adoption. So there's not necessarily like a relationship between team size or project volume and number of tools used, but it was really around how quickly a team adopted new tools and technology. And of course, Fuel Cycle as a technology company, we'd love to recommend that you adopt lots of different software and of course always install us. But the research that the data that we found, and by the way, our R-square here was 0.3. Was that the typical MR department licenses about 8 software platforms, and that depth of adoption and utilization was overall more important than the breadth or the number of tools and programs we had access to. And so again, when we asked researchers, why, what prevented them from adopting new tools, and what prevented the depth of adoption that leads to higher self-appraisal of effectiveness. Again, really the answer came back that they have too many priorities, too many initiatives, and too much going on in order to make in order to fully adopt and get value out of the tools and technologies that they have available today. So this brings us to our third point. And this one is my favorite, the CAGR measure, so the compound annual growth rate. That is the only objective dependent variable that we have in our data set, and thus it's my favorite because it really lends itself to like a more empirical objective analysis here. And so R-square was 0.29 here, and the independent variable was the speed of adoption of new methodologies. So kind of along the same lines of that innovation rate that we talked about from the GRIT report from last year. So we had teams self-evaluate their adoption rate of non-traditional research methodologies. And an example list is things like behavioral economics, social data mining, and other abilities that kind of really go beyond traditional survey research. And it could be qual, it could be quant, it could be big data, it could be small data, whatever it was. There was a rate of innovation and willingness to adopt new tools and technologies that and the rate that they adopted them was the strongest predictor of compound annual growth. And so when we looked at the motivations for companies not adopting new tools and technologies, they really came up with 3 primary reasons. And so, of course, at the bottom, we see time, which is very, kind of a common response is we just don't have time to be trained, we don't have time to learn. But interestingly, a couple other things that really bubbled up to the top. it's risk aversion, right? So don't mess with a good thing. We have our trackers, we have our survey, so why would we change anything at all? And the second thing was knowledge, is we just aren't educated enough on, where do we start? Where do we, how do we start getting into behavioral economics? How do we start, employing a social data mining and use that in meaningful ways for our research? So those were kind of like the top two things that really bubbled up that prevented adoption of new and innovative methods. And then, of course, the third was kind of the time and resources thing that we mentioned earlier. So those are kind of the three primary things that we've found so far. And really, this program that we have here at Field Cycle and this research we're starting to do is really the foundation for a lot more research in the future. And so we're asking ourselves, okay, so what's next and where do we go from here? Well, of course, we want to start repeating this research and doing more so that we can, further advance knowledge here. But the number one thing is that we really want to reduce the number of subjective variables and start looking at more, objective, empirical dependent variables, and kind of reduce the dependency on self-evaluation and look more at things like compound annual growth rate that we think will be very helpful. And so, the results that we, shared here today were so much more significant that we're going to focus a lot of our research around training practices, technology adoption, and education and dispersion on new and innovative methodologies in the future. So you can expect to see this type of research coming up from Fuel Cycle, from Megan, from our team throughout the course of this year as we continue our study and focus on on this particular topic. And with that, Megan, if you have anything to add, that's great. Otherwise, we can go to questions.
Yeah, let's dive into the questions.
Yeah, so thank you, Rick. Thank you, Megan. And like you said, with that, we will open it up to Q&A. And I just want to remind everybody, while we have Rick and Megan here on the line, if you have any questions, please just enter them either into the question or chat box into the GoToWebinar interface. But I do have a handful of questions that have come in so far. So first, I have one from Tom that I think is going to be best for Megan to answer. And he wants to dive in a little bit more about the relationship between team size and effectiveness. If you could go into that, Megan.
Yeah, of course. So when we look at size and effectiveness, we did see some relationship, but the R-square there was so small that we really couldn't call it out at this point. So I think that that's something that we're going to explore further in future research, and it may be that perhaps team size itself doesn't guarantee effectiveness, but rather maybe a strapped team or a small team is something that contributes to ineffectiveness or something like that. So I think that's a good future research question that we'll be looking forward to exploring in more detail.
Great. Did you have anything to add to that, Rick?
Yep, that's perfect. Exactly right.
Wonderful. So we did have a few more questions come in. I have one from John, and he says, I think I'd suggest a key issue in silos. Large firms have many teams and many studies, but often the teams don't know about the work other teams have or are doing. Also, each study should start with a review of prior or third-party research rather than always starting with a blank slate. So maybe, from Rick, you could dive into more kind of where we're planning to take the next steps on this research and kind of correlate it to some of the feedback that John would like to see in future research.
Yeah, so, hey, John, thanks for the comment. And just to kind of piggyback on there, what I think I heard is that, there's a lot of different research tools and research efforts kind of around an organization, around the enterprise now. It's relatively easy for someone to sign up for, SurveyMonkey over in product and start running their own surveys, whereas the, insights group is doing some other research, and maybe somebody in finance really has a question, they're going out and doing their own research. And so, in principle, we strongly agree with the dispersion of research throughout the, throughout the enterprise. And it's something that we focus on this topic a lot. And so in the future, yes, we will absolutely expand the scope of our study to include not just market research departments, but also their stakeholders in general.
Great. Thank you, Rick. So I had another one come in from Mark, and it's a question about how we conducted some of the research. He asked, did you look at research budget in relation to gross profit or net income or anything like that? I think, Rick, maybe this might be a good question for you to take.
Yeah. So great question. So we looked, so the question is, the overall budget, like the research budget, and then a number of potential different dependent variables. So number one, on the budget side, yes, we definitely looked into that. And again, similar to the team size question, R square, it was significant, but it was so low that it didn't bubble up in our findings like as something that seemed relatively important. Obviously there's more research to bear out there, so we're not making a definitive case. We're just saying in this study, R square was relatively low. As far as looking at the other potential dependent variables like net income, things like that. So we didn't look at those this time. I think growth rate tends to be the most interesting, dependent variable as far as like the measure for financial success, largely because the market research or customer insights function largely serves as like helping products develop, helping customer experience improve, helping go to market. And so it tends to have market research has a greater effect on growth rate rather than on net income, where something, net income can change with the financial structure of the company or with other things that are exogenous to the research department. And so for that reason, I think the CAGR in general is going to be our favorite metric for measuring the financial success impact of market research departments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rick. I think that is all the questions that we have time for today, but I do want to encourage anybody. I'm going to put Rick and Megan's contact details on the screen right now. And I want to remind everybody that this is just the first step in this research. We plan to conduct even more. So if you have feedback or areas where you'd like us to take the direction on our next steps, please reach out directly to either Rick or Megan, because, this is a collaborative research, so we want help on, what you're trying to find out and what you're doing to build an effective market research department within your own teams. So with that, I just want to thank Rick and Megan again for spending their time here with us today. It's always great information, and it's really exciting to share some of the proprietary research that we're doing with FieldCycle with everybody. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, everybody, and I think with that, we'll end today's presentation.